Welcome back to Harvest Online. We're so glad that you decided to make us a part of your day whenever and wherever you're watching from. Do us a favor, click that subscribe button right down there. We would also love for you to go to harvest.247 on Facebook and Instagram and follow and like those pages as well. And we are right in the middle of a series about the Psalms of Ascent, which are songs and psalms that the nation of Israel would recite as they were journeying up to Jerusalem for the various festivals and feasts of the time. We started off in Psalm 120, which was lamenting our surroundings, lamenting what was in our heart, and seeking repentance for those things. Then we moved on to where we're lifting our eyes to the hill of Zion in Psalm 121. 122 was all about worship and the house of the Lord and kind of declaring the house of the Lord and having a structure for worship in our life. And then Psalm 123 is looking above the hills beyond Jerusalem to the Lord in heaven. When we think about snapshots are great because it's just a picture of what was, right? It's just telling us something that is. There's no commentary on it. There's none of that. There's not a lecture on it. There's not someone trying to explain it often. It's just, here's what happened at a given point in time. One of my favorite pictures that I've ever seen, I saw actually on our trip to London and of Winston Churchill standing in the rubble of London. And I was just struck by that picture because it was my favorite picture because you just see him standing there. There's no commentary. You can try to imagine what was going on in his mind, imagine what was going on around him, but he's just standing in the midst of the rubble of London. And what it spoke to me was, it's like, here's a snapshot of a leader of a country in the midst of it with his people. And that's probably why he was so beloved and so, by the people during World War II. But I love that snapshot, but I don't really know where it was. Nobody had a little writing of, oh, Winston Churchill was saying this or speaking this. It was just this snapshot, this moment in history of him just looking there solemn at the rubble of London. I love snapshots, right? Because we all have snapshots, and snapshots are pictures of what was done, right? And if we were to look on our phones or look in a picture book, it's just snapshots of what was done, what was taken, what people were doing at a given point in a given time in their life. And as with most Psalms, Psalms are kind of like a snapshot, right? It's like what somebody is feeling, what somebody is thinking about in that moment, what they're writing to the Lord in that moment. They're just these snapshots. And it's not necessarily always an instruction of what to do. It's just we are provided kind of this instance of what is done. And one of the hard things about preaching through the Psalms is you're taking poetic terminology and trying to boil them down into some practical application. But what happens when we see Psalms or when we read Psalms is that we have practical evidence or observational evidence of what happens when a person of faith goes about believing and loving and following God. And so Psalm 123 is about service to others. It's about service to God. It's about what happens when someone serves God and serves others with their whole heart. And so when we kind of take a snapshot and look at the life of a servant or a follower of Jesus, here's the question: what does a snapshot of our life show others about following Jesus? That if someone were to take a snapshot of our life, what would it say about following Jesus? Would it show kindness? Would it show hope? Would it show love? Would it show what would it show? What would it show about our idols? What would it show about how we give our time and our money and our effort? What would it show about someone who is serving Jesus? Well, let's read a little bit of a snapshot at Psalm 123. And this is what it says: "To you I lift up my eyes, O you who are enthroned in the heavens. Behold, as the eyes of servants look to the hand of their master, as the eye of a maidservant to the hand of her mistress, so our eyes look to the Lord our God, till he has mercy upon us." And then verse 3, "Have mercy upon us, O Lord, have mercy upon us, for we have more than enough of contempt. Our soul has had more than enough of the scorn of those who are at ease, of the contempt of the proud." And so what we see in this is kind of this attitude of a servant. We're going to break these down, but look, behold, as the eyes of servants look to the hand of their master, the eyes of a maidservant to the hand of their mistress, so our eyes look to the Lord our God till he has mercy upon us. It's talking about what does the attitude of the servant look like? What does the heart of the servant look like? And it's the heart and it's the attitude that's always looking off to the Lord. It's always looking to God. And so here's the thing. When the attitude of serving is learned, the life of the servant will be exemplified. So let's break this down a little bit so it makes a little bit more sense. Verse 1, the psalmist declares his intention and action of his life to lift his eyes up to the Lord, meaning beyond what he can see. God is a God that is in the spirit. God is a God that is in the heavens, right? And so he's lifting his eyes up beyond what he can see. This means that his eyes are not on his circumstances. His eyes are not on himself, but his eyes are on the Lord. By remembering where God is, the psalmist grows in trust and confidence. Because what he's doing is he's saying, as far as God is above us in the heavens, that's how much authority he has and sovereignty he has over all of the circumstances and situations of life. He is a huge God. He is a big God who is capable of taking care of the things that happen in our life. Earth may have no mercy or help, but heaven has plenty of mercy and help. So the view here that the psalmist begins with is the view that we are to have as servants of God, not the view on our circumstances, not the view on ourselves, but the view of always looking, always gazing off, always seeking God. This shows the posture of the heart of a servant, of a follower of Jesus. It's declaring where the perspective should be first. The gaze of a follower of Jesus is upward, not inward, and not outward. And so it's showing this heart attitude that we start as a servant of God, right? That we're always looking to God. We're always looking at God. We're always looking for God. We're always looking beyond the circumstances, beyond ourselves to God as we are trying to live a life as a follower of Jesus. And people begin to see that attitude, see that posture of our heart in our life. Because when the attitude of serving is learned, the life of a servant will be exemplified. When you begin to learn what the attitude of a servant is, that it is an eye or a gaze that is beyond ourselves and beyond our circumstances, people begin to see that and becomes this amazing example of what a life of a servant is always to be looking toward. The example pictures here in these verses, verse 2, it pictures kind of like a waiter or a butler standing behind his master seated at dinner. The servant looks to the hand of his master for the slightest indication of need or want to instantly meet the need. It is with that same intensity and devotion and steadfastness that the psalmist looks to God. The first is through dependence. The hands of the master provides all that is needed. The second is submission. The hand of the master directs the servant's work, meaning we live a life not toward what we want to do, but we live a life fixed on what Jesus wants us to do, and he directs our steps. And it is also a life of discipline that the hand of the master also corrects the servant. That there's moment of God that he can come into our life and correct. He can set right things. It's like if you have a child and you discipline your child, you do it out of love. Why? Because you want to correct the behavior. You want to correct the attitude. You want to make sure that they're respectful, that they're honoring, that they're headed in the right direction. And so when we see what the psalmist is writing about, it's this complete and utter dependence on the Lord, who is sovereign over all things, not only to provide for all of what we need, to direct our steps for what we need to do, but also to come in and also discipline us when we are not on the right path, right? Or when we're not actually obeying him. Now he says this phrase, and I think that this is an important phrase. He says, till he has mercy on us. The psalmist does not demand an immediate answer. He doesn't demand an immediate conclusion. But what he is saying is that he will persevere patiently until the Lord extends mercy. Not that the Lord will never extend mercy. Mercy will come, but he will patiently persevere following Jesus until the mercy has come, till the answer of the prayer has come, till the resolution has come. He does not demand it happen immediately. That is the attitude. It is an attitude and a posture of the heart that trusts the Lord, that is dependent on him as his servant, that says, I know in his timing, when it is good for me, God will bring about a resolution. God will bring about something in my life. But until then, I will patiently persevere following Jesus, right? It's an attitude. It's an amazing, amazing attitude. that someone who follows Jesus can give a great testimony in their life of just their trust and their dependence in God's sovereignty. Because when the attitude of serving is learned, the life of a servant will be exemplified. This is the psalmist teaching us this attitude of serving, of patience, of casting our eyes, the eyes of our heart onto the Lord and not on our surrounding circumstances. Verse 3, the psalmist wasn't content to only wait for mercy, but he also begged for it. He demonstrated that waiting on the Lord is not a passive thing, that as followers of Jesus and servants of Jesus, as we're waiting on the Lord for something, we don't just have to sit there passively and say, okay, I'm going to wait. We can beg. We can go before him. We can ask. We can continue to beg and ask and ask and ask. He repeated the request for mercy, showing the intensity of his plea. There's this phrase, more than enough, in it. And the Hebrew word here means to be saturated, meaning to have the appetite fully satisfied as applied to one who is hungry or thirsty. So then it comes to mean this, that the idea here that the psalmist is getting in is that as much contempt had been thrown upon them as could be, they could experience no more. Meaning that there are these moments where as much things are thrown on top of us, we're experiencing as much calamity or trials or tribulations that we can experience no more. And in those moments, we don't have to be passive. We can beg and go before the Lord, right? And say, God, give me mercy. And that's what verses 2 and 3 introduce, is they introduce the mercifulness of God. And so this is what mercy is kind of defined as: the upward look to God in the heavens and the expectation that he will come down and enter our condition. That God extends his mercy because he has it in the heavens, but he will come down and release it into our circumstances and our condition. It's an expectation of the servant of the Lord that we wait patiently for, because when the attitude of serving is learned, the life of a servant will be exemplified. And verse 4 talks about scorn, feeling or belief that someone or something is worthless or despicable. This scorn is never easy to bear, but is especially painful when it comes from those who seem to be at ease or who seem to have few problems or difficulties in life. And there's a great quote by a commentator on this psalm, Dr. Boyce, and he says this. He says, the reason people ridicule what they oppose, aside from it being so easy, is that it is demoralizing and frequently effective. It is effective because it strikes at the hidden insecurities or weaknesses that almost everybody has. And so when we think about scorn, or we feel the scorn of God because maybe he's not answering our question, our request or whatnot, we're like, man, it plays on our insecurities and our weaknesses. When we experience the scorn of others, it preys on our insecurities and on our weaknesses. And so the psalmist, as he's in this moment of submission and trying to seek God and trying to say, hey, God, do something on my behalf, this scorn is kind of heaped on his head and in his spirit that makes it even more difficult to bear. But what we see in the psalm is the attitude and the heart of a servant. We see that the eyes and the heart of a servant are gazed upon the Lord, are seeking the Lord, are always looking beyond the circumstances and beyond the situations and beyond everything in this life and looking to the Lord that is in heaven. We see also in verses 2 and in 3 that the psalmist is showing us the heart of a servant that is always dependent on the Lord, right? We're dependent for his hands to provide what we need. We're dependent on him to guide and direct our steps when we're seeking wisdom. And we're also dependent on him to say, hey, if I'm in the wrong, correct me. That the heart of a servant is teachable and it's open to that. But we also see that the heart of the servant is one who can experience a lot, who can have a lot of scorn heaped on them. And then what they do in turn is beg for God's mercy and wait patiently as they persevere through it, knowing that God is going to bring the mercy. God is going to intervene. It's just in his time when he wants. And so what we see in Psalm in these just 4 verses is this attitude of a servant. Maybe not always what we want to hear. Maybe not, doesn't seem victorious. But what the psalmist is doing is giving us a snapshot. Giving us a snapshot of what the heart of a servant of Jesus looks like, what the heart of a servant of Jesus sees and what they look toward, what the heart of the servant does as they wait patiently and they're completely dependent on the Lord, and what the heart of a servant, how the heart of a servant responds when they're going through difficult times by begging and seeking God for his mercy and then waiting patiently on it. We love like these massive victorious like conclusions, especially in America, right? Like we love action movies that end victorious and the guy gets the girl and then they get married and then, you know, they win the ball game, or we got to have those conclusions. But here's the reality. In serving Jesus, in the moment, doesn't always feel like we're going to get the victory. But what the psalmist is showing us here is the attitude of a servant that anticipates the victory because they understand the bigness and the sovereignty and the mercy and the love and the faithfulness of God. And that if we place our faith in Jesus Christ, we ultimately get the victory even on the other side as we get to spend eternity with him in heaven. And so when we read when we're reading the Psalm 123, it may not leave us with this amazing victorious feel at the end, right? But what it does is it gives us the snapshot of a servant who gazes their eyes and their heart on the Lord, a servant who is completely dependent on the Lord, and a servant who begs for mercy in the midst of scorn and ridicule in the valley. And here's the thing, it's a testimony and it's an example that when this attitude of serving is learned, the life of a servant will be exemplified. It will show others what it's like to follow Jesus. God bless you.